This is the 15th and final in a series of videos on euphemistic processes. In this one, I want to move beyond the processes themselves to talking about where they can lead, which is to say to lexicalization. Lexicalization is the process where a novel expression becomes part of the lexicon, part of the vocabulary of the language, which is to say that in our case, since we're talking about euphemistic expressions, they become euphemisms. That is, they conventionally become part of the language as an understood way to avoid a dysphemism. We've got, again, this diagram. This lays out the typical strategies, and perhaps not all of the strategies, but the main strategies for avoiding dysphemisms. So we can either target the form or the meaning. In other words, we can innovate at the level of the, we can do a formal innovation at the level of form, or we can do a semantic innovation at the level of meaning. In either way, the idea is that we find a new way to get at the same idea, but without actually uttering the dysphemism. What I'm getting at here is what linguists call the euphemism treadmill. We begin with a euphemistic substitute. That is the novel expression. So somebody at some time, instead of saying shit, said shoot. Instead of saying shut the fuck up, they said shut the front door. Instead of saying fuck, they said the old in, out, right? So in all of those cases, there was some instance where somebody came up with this new way of avoiding the bad term. But in the case of euphemisms, that novel euphemistic expression caught on. It became part of our vocabulary. In other words, it became a euphemism, and a euphemism is a conventionalized way to avoid a dysphemism. Now, the next step, though, in this process, and this is something we'll get into more when we talk about historical linguistics, when we talk about where some of our taboo words came from in the first place. The fact is that euphemisms often go to one of two different routes. They can either become an established part of the vocabulary where they no longer take on that euphemistic feel to them. They're no longer euphemisms, they're no longer terms of avoidance, they become just the terms themselves. So arguably, make love has become such a part of our vocabulary that we no longer think of it as a euphemism, as an avoidance. It just is the word that we use, or have sex, right? Or a term like BM, which started as an abbreviation for bowel movement. Over time, it just became a word that we use for it, or many borrowings serve that same purpose, and then they become orthophonisms. The other possibility, though, is that some of these words get too associated with what they stood for, right? So that alternative route of becoming a dysphemism could be cases like, for example, pussy, which began as a metaphoric substitute euphemistic expression that became a euphemism, but it became too associated with female pudenda that it became a bad word in and of itself. The same thing happened with cock, which has a very convoluted history to it, but it was originally the word for the male chicken, and it became associated with penises, and then too associated with penises, and became a dysphemism itself that had to be avoided. Now, once we've got that, you can also get other processes. Dysphemisms over time may lose their tabooness. I would say that's happened with gay, for example, which began as a euphemistic expression for homosexuals. Then it became a euphemism, a dysphemism itself, and now it's an orthophonism. So it's gone through that whole cycle. And likewise, orthophonisms can over time get too associated with taboo terms and become dysphemisms. Arguably, I've had students who say that clitoris is a taboo word for them. So arguably, that orthophonism, clitoris, became too much for us and became a dysphemism, at least for some speakers.